I'm Tom Rogan for the Washington Examiner. Today, as part of our Confronting China series, we're joined by Elbridge Colby. Elbridge is the keystone author of the 2018 National Defense Strategy, principal at the Marathon Initiative, and is the author of the fantastic book, I would say, The Strategy of Denial, which comes out in paperback in...
It came out in September.
Came out in September, okay. And everyone should buy it, really.
Thank you.
It's a very good book. Elbridge, so last week we had the release of the China Military Power Report by DOD. What are your key takeaways from that? And something we've talked about before, this sense of urgency that perhaps is lacking in some discussions in Washington about the threat China poses.
Sure, great to be with you, Tom, and with the Examiner, really a pleasure. And thanks for the kind words in the book. I mean, I think the China Military Power Report that came out last week, I mean, the takeaways are sort of a continuation of the increasing sense of concern. I mean, basically what I'd say some of the big takeaways, the estimate on China's nuclear buildup increased to be up to about 1,500 warheads, which is what our cap is, at least depending on how you measure it, under New START, by the middle of the next decade, possibly sooner. Mm-hmm. And that the Chinese military has made improvements in their ability to operate and operate together, and especially that their ambitions are expanding. I mean, that was one of the biggest things to me that is a takeaway from the report, is like there have been these sort of mental, sort of fixed sort of views on China. It won't build up its nuclear forces. It won't have overseas bases. It won't, have a very expansive global military. Each one of those has been knocked down, and it's like now it's like accepted. I mean, the military power report went through the names of countries that China's explored basing options, mm-hmm. and it's like pretty extraordinary, right. Including Equatorial Guinea on the Atlantic coast of Africa. Right. So that's the thing. So urgency. Now, one of the big takeaways, particularly in the briefings, it seems, around the report rather than the report itself. The report itself was very, I would say, kind of empirical and clinical. It didn't make a strong assessment that I could see of the relative, sort of military balance across the strait and, come down hard. China's going to not go on this date. It would go on this date. It didn't. It was sort of vague. Mm-hmm. The briefings around the report by administration officials seemed to emphasize that invasion is not imminent. My view, I would be very surprised if China comes tomorrow, goes right. tomorrow or in 2 months. I think Admiral Gilday was right recently by saying you can't rule it out.
Right.
Because even though the Chinese may not think they're ready, they may think they're readier than we and the Taiwanese are. And that was another thing right. that came out of the reports. The Taiwanese are woefully underprepared.
Right.
And so that came out to me. But here's the point, Tom, is if the invasion, God forbid, happens in 2 years or 5 years or even 7 years, that is like a 5-alarm fire right now from a defense planning point of view, right. Instead of like, hey, don't worry about it. Undersecretary called, the Pentagon's like, oh, the invasion's not going to happen for the next 2 years. It's like, well, 2 years, that's right. nothing in defense right. terms.
And I'm sure a lot of the people that you're talking to, that I've talked to, this sense of urgency is something that doesn't seem to permeate in some of the discussions in Washington. And as an extension of what you were saying there, one thing that I think some of our viewers might be interested in is, we still do have this idea that, if we have to go to Taiwan, we're going to win. It's going to be pretty easy. What are the kind of key points you would say to people that really, this is a conflict we could lose?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's absolutely possible we could lose. Why? The Chinese, first and foremost, we have never dealt with a rival, at least in the last 150 years, that is of greater economic size than we are. Mm-hmm. I mean, bear in mind, during the Second World War, when we were allied with the Soviet Union and the British Empire, and a few others, the United States economy alone was larger than Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy. Right. And by the way, before the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, we were using the world's largest industrial base that we possessed in shipbuilding industry to undertake a massive military mobilization before December 7th, 1941. Mm-hmm. Today, the world, China's, by some measures, at least an equivalent or possibly larger economy, if you look at what's called purchasing power parity terms, which tends to be more useful in military
right.
terms. China's a larger economy. It has the advantages, it's laser focused on Taiwan. It has the advantages of catch-up, lower labor costs, and it's right next to the fight, right? What right. we're fighting over is right. not the Galapagos Islands. We're fighting over Taiwan. We can get into why that is and why it's worthwhile. But that makes it a lot harder for us. And so just on those basis alone, on the also, as we've increasingly been seeing, you see reports on in the press almost every day now, our defense industrial base is having trouble keeping up with the demands of the Ukrainians, right. dealing with a Russian military that has very much surprised me and many others in its underperformance.
Right.
So we're talking about fighting, God forbid, a war with China, the world's largest industrial base, that's prepared for this.
Right.
And we're saying that we're having trouble dealing with Ukrainians, and people are saying, oh, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We're America. No. That is not the right attitude. The fundamental point that I would say on this, Tom, is like Tom Brady did not win Super Bowl after Super Bowl, I imagine, by in the offseason saying, hey, we're the Patriots. Like, we won't have to worry. We'll always be the best. And that's something General Milley said the other day, where the American military will be the best in 10 or 20 or 50 years. How do you know that?
Right.
That is not the attitude where we are sure that we are going to win, and by being able to win, we can effectively deter.
And as an extension on that point in Ukraine, that certainly I think we would agree is a concern that really matters. This idea that America being able to do everything really comes into a point where making that judgment significantly risks our ability to win with Taiwan. And I think as an extension there, we mentioned that the Chinese, long game, what they're doing in terms of areas in our anti-ballistic missiles, targeting our aircraft carriers, 6,000 people on each of those. What would you say to, if you were with President Biden and one of his advisors in the room is like, well, we need to lead in terms of sending more forces to Europe, as we've done. Some of our best forces, F-22s, Navy destroyers. What would you say is the cost to our capability in specific terms on Taiwan?
Yeah, great question. And let's I think put this in the proper perspective that you so ably do on a regular basis in your column. This is not just about Ukraine and Taiwan. We are behind the curve fundamentally on the most consequential issue, what the administration itself is saying is the most consequential issue, which is China.
Yeah.
And Jake Sullivan is saying there's a distinct threat of an invasion. Tony Blinken has said that they've moved up the timeline. So there's a real problem, and we're not where we need to be. And the best defense experts, Dave Ochmaneks, Andy Krepineviches of the world, they're saying this, General Clint Hino in the Air Force, they're saying we're not where we need to be. Okay, so the way I think about this is like, you've got a case of acute heart disease. Mm-hmm. You also have arthritis and tennis elbow. Mm-hmm. It's like, my view is you don't worry about the tennis elbow and the arthritis.
Right.
You figure out the heart disease. So this is not, Ukraine is not itself like the only part of the problem. It's that we should be doing literally less of everything else.
Right.
And making sure we get this thing right, because as Churchill put it, if you get things right in the decisive theater, you can put things right in other places afterwards. And the thing is, I actually don't, at this point, I don't understand the logic for doubling down in Europe, because we're on a losing trajectory in Asia, the world's decisive theater, and we could essentially lose World War III. Mm-hmm. Meantime, the Russians are manifestly less of a threat than I had supposed. Mm-hmm. So why are we increasing forces and sustaining them? Meantime, the Europeans dwarf the Russians in economic capacity.
Right.
So, and it's going to take the Russians years to recapitalize their conventional forces.
And, the risk is that it reinforces that traditional European idea that, well, let's kind of let the Americans pay for this stuff because we can spend it on our welfare systems. With Xi Jinping, another thing here, that political level, right, in the Chinese military being essentially an extension of directly an extension of the party versus the nation. I really think it would be valuable to our viewers if you kind of underline how important Taiwan is to the Chinese. That this is not some kind of peripheral issue.
Yeah. Well, I wrote something for Time a couple of months ago on why Taiwan is important for us, and I don't look at this. I look at this from the perspective of what's in Americans' national interest. Like, I'm not trying to start a fight with anybody, but I think we should look after our foreign policy should be about our enlightened self-interest. And in that context, the fact that Taiwan is a democracy and is a prosperous economy, those are admirable, but they're not reasons for hundreds of thousands of Americans or tens of thousands of Americans to put their lives at risk. So why is that? Well, what we don't want to have happen is China to dominate the world economy. Mm-hmm. That is what this is about. And that is, in a sense, that was what the Cold War was also about, and also World War II and World War I, which is we didn't want anybody to become so powerful that they could dominate our national life. And we can see, look at the criticisms, and I'm very sympathetic with them. I haven't worked out all this stuff, but look at how Apple is, putting pressure, on Elon Musk and Twitter, but at the same time kowtowing to the Chinese Communist Party. Right. That's just a taste, right? Because they're afraid.
The NBA, Hollywood.
The NBA, they're already afraid because of market access.
Right.
Just for China, but imagine if China dominated Asia, which is the world's largest market area.
Right.
That's what this is about, and Taiwan is very important for that, because countries in the region are looking at Taiwan's fate to tell, because they're all saying, I don't want to live under Chinese hegemony, but if my alternative is getting crushed, I'll cut a deal.
Right.
And Taiwan is significant in that respect, and also militarily. For the Chinese, Taiwan is of really central significance, whether we like it or not. One is for the geopolitical reasons, which people tend to emphasize less. If they're going to establish this dominance over Asia, they're going to have to get through Taiwan, basically. I mean, to simplify it. And are they pursuing that goal of regional hegemony? I think so, not only because of the expansive nature of being a great power and the Chinese Communist Party, but also because they clearly see that they're destined for rivalry and probably confrontation with the United States. And there's decoupling, the semiconductors. So if politics is upstream of economics in this world of geopolitics, then China's going to have a strong incentive to make sure that the United States doesn't, over time, muster. This is one of the reasons that concerns me from an urgency point of view, is there are good things like the semiconductor stuff happening and more pressure from the Europeans, but if you're China and you see that dynamic continuing, you have an incentive to strike out and prevent that consolidation of the world.
Move quicker.
Exactly. And of course, China cares about Taiwan as a so-called renegade province. And they genuinely appear to believe that.
And Xi Jinping sees it, I think, as a test of destiny, right?
Exactly.
One of the challenges, of course, though, is Taiwan's, only recently really reaching 2% of GDP on defense spending. I think should be probably 5 times that if you look at the threat they're facing. Japan taking, productive steps, but still perhaps deficient. And obviously with, Taiwan, the KMT now rising, which is the traditional pro-Beijing party, but, they have movement. How do you see the next 2 or 3 years? And there's a huge amount of unpredictability here. And yet all the people we talked to, China very well could invade in that period. And this is not hyperbole. Yeah. How do you see the next 2 or 3 years going? And what, if you were in the room with the president, would you be telling him to do now?
Well, great question. In terms of the timeline, I mean, I think it is possible. I would say that from a military balance perspective, the time of acutest danger is later in the decade, probably around 2027 or maybe thereafter. But again, this is all relative based on Beijing's perception of when is optimal to go. That would be a judgment of the military balance, of the political situation there, here, on Taiwan, Xi Jinping's own personal calculus. So I think the right attitude on this is we don't know, but we're now in the window where it's possible.
Right.
And that we could be leaning farther and farther out the window over time, but we're sort of in the window. So what do I do? That's what sort of is actually bewildering to me, is like, okay, so all these people are saying that China's the primary threat. We're in a decisive decade, as the administration's national security strategy put it. They're building up this incredible military, the Chinese, et cetera, and yet things seem to go on as they were. And it's sort of this kind of, don't hurry too much. We can walk and chew gum. Oh, the Japanese are going to spend 2% maybe by 2027, and Taiwan is sort of leisurely moving in that direction, and we're giving ourselves high fives.
Right.
And to me, that's like, well, wait a minute. I thought there was an invasion by a guy who's like ruthless and like is probably going to crack down ruthlessly on these protests if I had to bet.
Yeah.
And who knows, but if and when. But if that's the case, shouldn't we be like all hands on deck?
Right.
I mean, so for instance, and I write, these issues are complicated, but like the way John Kirby talks about Ukraine versus the way John Kirby was talking about the protests in China or Taiwan, just evinces like a really different. To me, their revealed priority is Ukraine.
Right. Even
though they say that China. So in one part of their brain, they're saying it's China. But to me, this is like almost criminally irresponsible because we know there's a train coming at us.
Right.
And we're not like trying to move out of the way. So what I would say to the president is, so if I, like the Secretary of Defense is, I would say, this is the biggest problem by far. We are in the point where everything has to be sacrificed to this.
Right.
So let's say, Mr. Secretary, Mr. President, clear your agenda for the next, as long as it takes. Every meeting should be about how we make sure that we're okay on Taiwan, both in the near term and the long term. And people who help me solve that will get promoted and rewarded. And people who don't and say, oh, I need more forces from CENTCOM or EUCOM, they will get demoted, in some cases probably fired. To make an example, like Dick Cheney famously fired the Air Force Chief of Staff, or Bob Gates. You make an example to encourage the others, as Voltaire said, right? So that's the kind of thing. And then if you're Secretary of Defense, you go to the President, you say, Mr. President, here's the money I need, and I need it specifically for this. I need a special authorization. I need you to give a national address. I need authorizations. I don't need to get an environmental permit to build more stuff on Guam or Palau or whatever it is, or in California. I can use special contracting authorities because we're not going to go through all this hullabaloo. And that would be the kind of thing. We can do this if we want. I mean, look at Operation Warp Speed, just to take an example.
Right.
If you want, we can, people know a lot more than I do about the merits and all that stuff, but like you can produce something very quickly if you put your mind to it.
And building up that munitions base,
Right.
That we don't have enough, that we can't produce enough weapons, ships, whatever. But just taking on. Anyway, Elbridge, I think that really covers a lot of the bases in a very finite period, which is a tribute to you. Elbridge Colby, principal at the Marathon Initiative, author of the 2018 National Defense Strategy, and author of that fantastic book, The Strategy of Denial. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Pleasure.